Thank you, Mr. President. On May 4th, 2015, Officer Brian Moore was killed in the line of duty. This was an exceptional young police officer in New York City. He was young enough that he still lived in his father's home, but he was experienced enough, old enough, that he had already become a decorated officer in the NYPD. He had made over 150 arrests since joining the department just 5 years ago. Commissioner Bill Bratton said in his very brief career, he already proved himself to be an exceptional young officer. We've heard a lot about law enforcement gone wrong. But the reality is that every single day, police officers are under threat, are in danger. And all Brian Moore did was pull up on the evening of May 2nd behind someone that was acting in a suspicious manner. And as they began talking to him, the man turned and fired at the car. Officer Moore was struck in the cheek. He had trauma to his brain. 90 minutes after the shooting, officers arrested the man who perpetrated this crime. He did it with a stolen weapon, one of 23 stolen weapons from a 2011 robbery at Little Bates and Tackle pawn shop in Perry, Georgia. People said of him, he was a great kid. I can't say a bad thing about him. He always had a smile on his face. He was an officer who was rising through the ranks very, very quickly, beloved in his community. He grew up on Long Island, tragically and ironically, in a town with an athletic field at the high school named after Edward Byrne, another alumnus of that high school who was killed in the line of duty as a 22-year-old rookie in 1988. That name may be familiar to us because we now hand out millions of dollars in Byrne grants all across the country. Another alumni of this particular high school shot down. Brian is one of 86 people across this country who are killed by guns every day, 2,600 a month and 31,000 a year. Not every single one of these deaths is preventable. I don't know whether Brian Moore's was preventable, but what I know is that many of these deaths are preventable, that there has to be a reason why these numbers are so out of whack with every single other country in the industrialized world. And a lot has to do with the reality of this place, that as these numbers continue to ring up day after day, month after month, year after year at catastrophic levels, we do absolutely nothing about it. And Mr. President, we've got to start thinking about not just the cost to the families, and it's not just the mother and the father and the brother and the sister. If you look at the pictures of Brian Moore's funeral, they're heartbreaking in the tragedy that is washing over the family members. The average homicide by gun has 22 different victims that are affected by that, and it often leads to cycles of violence in which there are killings for retribution, in which the trauma spirals lives of children and brothers and sisters downward. But let's just look for a second at the cost of one murder. Now, here are some numbers overall. A recent study showed that the annual cost of gun violence in America is $229 billion with a B. That is $47 billion more than Apple's 2014 worldwide revenue. But here's just the cost of one murder. $441,000 in direct costs. 87% of it is paid for by taxpayers. Over $400,000 to lock up the perpetrator. $2,000 when he's charged and sentenced. $11,000 for mental health treatment for the victims' families. $10,000 for the victims' hospital expenses. $450 just to transport to the hospital. And then $2,000 for police response and investigations. And that's not why we should take on the issue of gun violence in this country. We should do it simply to try to stop this scourge of murders. But if you just care about being a good steward of the taxpayers' dollars, then $441,000 a year that could be saved just by eliminating one of the 86 a day seems like a pretty good deal. Mr. President, Jose Araujo from Milford, Connecticut, was working for the Burns Construction Company in Bridgeport when he was shot at his job on a construction site after a suspect asked for a job and he was referred to the company's office. He started to head for the office. He turned around and he shot Jose. A family friend said he was a gentle giant. Whenever he walked in, there was a smile on his face. He always gave you a strong handshake. He's nice, generous, a man of peace. Another friend said, he's such a great person. If the world had more people like him, what a beautiful world we would live in. Jose leaves behind a 5-year-old son. Sanjay Patel was killed on April 6th in New Haven, Connecticut. He was just working like millions of other Americans, putting in his hours as a manager at a Citgo gas station when he was shot 4 times by an apparent robber at the station. The perpetrators took money and store merchandise. Specifically, they stole a box of cigars. They killed this guy over a box of cigars. Sanjay's wife was 6 months pregnant at the time. He had told her that he didn't want her to work while she was pregnant, in part because she had been injured in a house fire last year. In a tearful interview, she said that her husband took excellent care of her and the baby. He brought her ice cream and breakfast in bed. This is my first baby, she said, and my husband was so happy. Mr. President, the stats are overwhelming, whether it be the number of people who are killed by guns or the cost to the U.S. taxpayers. I try to come down here every couple weeks just to give voice to the victims of gun violence, figuring that if the numbers don't move this place, maybe the stories of those that are lost will. I can only tell a few a day, but it would take me, frankly, more time than we have here for debate on the floor to tell 86 stories every single day. This isn't just about the fact that I come from Newtown, Connecticut. This is the fact that there is a just regular drumbeat of gun violence throughout this country. And by doing nothing in the United States Senate, in the United States House, week after week, month after month, year after year, we effectively become complicit in these murders. We silently endorse this epidemic of gun violence when we don't even try to make gun trafficking, illegal gun trafficking, illegal at a federal level. When we don't stand with 90% of the American public, the vast majority of gun owners, 80 to 90% of gun owners, and just say simply that you shouldn't be able to get a gun if you're a criminal, and you should prove that you're not a criminal before you buy a gun. That we don't endorse simple gun safety technology to make sure that the gun that was used to kill Officer Moore can't be used by someone that isn't its intended user, its owner. It's technology developing that we could help, that we could assist, that would cut down on the use of stolen firearms in order to kill, in order to hurt people. And so I'll just keep coming down to the floor whatever chance I get to tell a handful of these tragic stories from Connecticut, from New York, from Chicago to Los Angeles, giving voices to the victims of gun violence so that someday, somehow, the United States Senate will recognize that though we can't eliminate these numbers, though we can't bring them down to zero, by smart, common sense legislation, we can make sure these numbers are much, much lower than they are today, with much, much less tragedy visited on American families and much, much less cost to American taxpayers.